But
Sure.
I want to welcome you and thank you so much, Bella Kovner, head of the unit, the technical unit at IsraAid. And we are going to be talking today about the amazing work that your organization does all over the planet. And I've been very inspired, but also in this last week, following closely because of the specific that is happening to the people of Mozambique and the quick response. So, Bella, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, how you came to
Sure.
this work, and tell us about your organization?
Sure. So first of all, it's a pleasure to be here today and talk about Israel and talk about the wonderful work that we're doing globally, not only in emergency response, but also in international development and relief and in addressing the social and economic needs of the most vulnerable populations. So, about me, my kind of personal journey in international development and humanitarian work starts in 2004 when I joined Brandeis University, Heller School in Massachusetts. The program, the MA program, graduate program for sustainable international development. As part of the program, I was also an intern in Cambodia, working on a US Department of Labor and UNICEF program to address the needs of young girls and women victims of trafficking for commercial sexual exploitation within the country and also across the border to Vietnam and Thailand. After I graduated, I started to work with an American INGO called World Education based in Boston. I was based in their HQ for 2.5 years, supporting programs, especially in Nepal, working under funding from the US Department of Labor, USAID, specifically on child labor, trafficking. These were kind of my main, and still are my main areas of expertise. I then relocated to Nepal. I was there for 2.5 years working under UNICEF on the integration of child soldiers. This was after the peace accords were signed in the country in 2008. Following Nepal, I was based in China for 2 years. And then I moved into a different region. I started to work for a Swiss organization named takes.The, mainly working with vulnerable children and child protection, education. I worked with them in Albania, in Romania, in Bulgaria, specifically addressing the needs of Roma children. I don't know, the Roma minority in Europe, as we all know them as the Gypsies. In 2013, I went back. I returned to Israel after 10 years abroad, and I started my PhD at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I did my PhD dissertation on children's rights and children's access to justice in conflict-ridden areas. During my PhD studies, I continued working as a consultant for the same NGOs that I worked with in the past. I was also teaching in a master's program for international development. And while I was teaching, I got to know IsraAid, first as a small organization. I'm talking about 2013 when they just started, it was a 5-people organization, mainly focused on relief and emergencies. So I kind of followed them. I knew about their work through my students who did internships with them. Some of them continued working with them. And about a year ago, after I already finished my PhD, I decided to kind of go back full time for work in international NGOs. I decided that there's no better place to do that than with IsraAid. By then, IsraAid was already an established NGO working in different areas, has a huge reputation in the country and also in the US and also in our countries of operation, and working in partnership with UNICEF, with GIZ, with the UN, UNHCR, with local organizations, with local governments, with ministries of education, ministries of social affairs. So it seems like
A
the right
perfect
thing to
match.
do. A
It seems
perfect
like a
match.
perfect match. How great.
Definitely,
And
definitely.
so you both have a very long history of work, lots of other places, but also in different related, interrelated, but different topic. And you've seen the work of the organization evolve from emergency response, humanitarian response, to a variety of other issues, including a big role in what's happening with the migration and the people fleeing, people who are refugees, and how that's being both handled everywhere along the path of flight, along the path of immigration or migration or relocation. You are famous for some special things that are happening in your work with those refugees. Can you tell our audience about some of those really unique
Right.
things that have really caught the attention of the global development community?
Right. So definitely we work. We started like we said, we start with emergency relief, emergency response, and then we continue to kind of the continuum to long-term community development, focus on different sectors, different disciplines. Our main target audience, like you said, are IDPs, refugees, asylum seekers. So we first start with them during the emergency context, and then we provide kind of more long-term support and assistance. So for example, if we look at kind of different contexts and some of our unique approaches, so for example, we have the CFS approach, which is the child-friendly space,
Hmm.
which is meant to support and address the needs of children who are out of school or children who are enrolled in school and still have different needs. They're kind of defined as vulnerable children. We work with the Venezuelan migrants in Colombia, for example.
Mhm.
Most of these children are not enrolled in the public system, education system in Colombia. And therefore, we have in different locations the child-friendly spaces where we have the children receive different services, whether these are educational services, protection services, to also support the families. 80% of these children who are enrolled in the CFS are later on enrolled and continue to the formal schooling system. So this is kind of like a bridging program. So this is one thing that we do. We have it in Colombia. We also have it in Kenya, in the refugee, also working with refugees from South Sudan. We have this program in northern Uganda, also working with displaced and most vulnerable communities. Another program that we have to address the needs of kind of children and people on the move is in Greece. We have informal education, early childhood development programs, also working with asylum seekers in Saloniki and in Sindos. Once the children are enrolled in schools, for example, in Mozambique, we also provide psychosocial support and training to teachers.
Hmm.
So in Mozambique, for example, we work in schools and with teachers across the country to help the teachers to support the children once they were enrolled, having in mind that these are all migrant children, displaced children, families that are affected by the natural disasters, affected by conflicts. Um, so once the children are already in school, we also continue providing support through the Ministry of Education alongside with UNICEF, training teachers. We also have DRR, disaster risk reduction programs in the schools. So this is a program that we have in Guatemala, for example. We have it also in Mozambique. We have it in other contexts as well. So to provide disaster risk reduction packages, training in the schools, so the schools are prepared. One of the things that we see in the schools, the challenge is not only getting the children to schools through the CFS or through other kind of supporting programs that we provide. Once the children are integrated in schools, it's really hard to keep them there, to keep them
Hmm.
enrolled, because the parents are afraid, the parents are worried that the children won't be safe in schools, that if a disaster hits the school again, the school won't be able to protect the children. And this is why it's also very important to provide the direct support to the teachers, to the schools, work centrally with the ministry also while the children are enrolled in the schools. So definitely the focus is on these most vulnerable populations, the migrants, the asylum seekers, the internally displaced. But I think that while we're doing that, we're also able to kind of support the entire school system in the communities where we work and also at the central level.
It seems like there's a very, very important emphasis on the children. Children are a lot of different ages, but the children, and not only their informalness in terms of whether they're in the school system, but also all the other services of protective services and food and other things. I'm guessing that as an organization, you begin to develop what you think of as policies that could make a long-term difference. Like, for example, building back the confidence that your child is safe in a school, especially if there'd been an earthquake or a cyclone or a conflict zone. So building back that does require that the larger community feels safe, and all of that. Our larger kind of global community looking at sustainable development goals has a lot of goals, but only addresses the special needs of children to a certain extent, infant mortality or whatever. Can you share with us your thinking over a long and varied career where children were at the center, and often children who were vulnerable and who were exploited or in danger of that? Can you give us your best ideas about how you think, as a global community, as nations, and as local communities, we should be thinking about the policies, the practices that could then make your work, your job easier, more successful, more long-term sustainable, because some of the policies were different or changed?
Right. Okay, I'm just writing. So I think whenever, just kind of as a background, as the general framework, whenever we have a situation, an emergency, a disaster, a human-made disaster, a natural-made disaster, like a hurricane, like an earthquake, like a conflict, a war, the first to be kind of affected by the situation and the last ones to be affected are always children. And this is something that we always need to bear in mind. And we also need to look at kind of double and triple vulnerabilities. So children are the most vulnerable to begin with, but when you have children of ethnic minorities or of racial or political minorities, if you have disabled children, if you have children living in poverty, with families with no access to land, with no proper access to food security. So this situation makes triple or more kind of layers of vulnerability that we as an organization, as the international community, we need to consider when looking at different programs and strategies and policies. And I think one of the things that we see is that, especially when we talk about migrants, children on the move, people on the move, whether these are asylum seekers, refugees, internally displaced people, economic migrants, the migration management policies are always looking at the interests of the state. They're not looking at the interests of the families of the people, and especially the children. And I think we can see that all over. We see it in Israel, we see it in Colombia, we see it in Greece, and we see it everywhere we go.
Texas.
Yes. So the main emphasis is always migration management. How do we manage the migration flows, especially in countries like Greece that have these huge influxes of migrants, a country which is unstable economically and socially. So this is, of course, the first thing that comes to their mind when they're dealing with the migrants and they come up with policies. So My recommendation is policies first look at the human aspect, look at the people who are behind these policies, and how can we make sure that we first address their needs first and foremost. So this is kind of the first, my
Children
first,
first. The
children
children
first, no
first.
matter what is their nationality, what's their country of origin. They're human beings, they're children, they have needs. All countries have ratified the CRC, the Convention of the Rights of the Child, which has very specific guidelines how to address the needs, how to treat children. Let's follow that. So this is my first kind of rule. The second thing, and this is also relates to the work done by IsraAid and our strategies and our approach, we never reinvent the wheel. We never kind of create our own structure. We never create a system. Like, so for example, a referral system, a referral pathways, a case management system when it comes to protection. We always work with the structures, with the systems, with the mechanisms that are already in place, even if they are very weak and they even weakened by the conflict and by the natural disaster, we work with the existing system. So as opposed to other organizations that come and sometimes create kind of alternative systems which work great, but what happens when they leave? What happens with the government structure? So I think that this is a very kind of important and strong pillar in our work. We always strengthen, build the capacity of what already is there, what already exists on the ground. And I think it's very complex and it's very challenging when we work with conflict-ridden areas such as South Sudan,
Right.
or Kenya or Uganda, countries that are very weak. There's no rule of law. The governance is very centralized and cannot really support children, and especially the migrant children. So I think that especially in these kind of contexts, it's very, very important to stick to the local, to the existing structures, and make sure that they're sustainable, make sure that they're functional, and make sure that the local communities and the local institutions have ownership over the issues that they're supposed to address.
Children first, and use the local systems and make them stronger and leave them stronger whenever that's the case.
Right. Because IsraAid and then all the other NGOs, at some point we will leave. We will not stay there forever. We don't want to stay there forever. That's not our mandate. That's not what we intended to do. Whether it's going to be 2 years or 5 or 10 years, eventually the local government, the local community has to own and address its own problems, whether it's related to the refugees, to the migrants, to dealing with natural disasters, to enrolling children in school, to make sure that they're kept in school, that they're getting their right education, that they're able to support themselves as adults and live dignified and stable lives.
So COVID turned the world upside down, but it also created danger. It created discrimination. It exposed disparities and inequities. I can imagine a million ways that it affected your work, but where is it taking you now as we enter a period where the more wealthy countries are trying to get their arms around and have access to vaccines, and some of that is making a difference, and it's becoming more clear that much of the world, or most of the world, is going to be excluded from at least the vaccine part of this, but not to mention oxygen and protective gear and other things.
Right.
How's this going to be in this next year?
It's the $1 million question, right? Nobody really has
I
the
bet you
answer.
guys are in the middle of a vice.
Yes, definitely. But I think that one of the things that COVID taught us, it taught us many things, like you said. But it hits most heavily and we see that in Israel, we see that in the States, and we see that definitely in the developing countries where we work, in the conflict-ridden areas and the disaster-affected areas. It hits the most vulnerable populations. So whoever is the kind of most vulnerable to begin with, whether it's an individual or a community or a minority, during COVID, we see, like we said, like a double or even triple vulnerability.
Right.
And we see more and more children that are excluded. People are losing their livelihoods. We see a rise in domestic violence and sexual-based violence. We see more cases of neglect. In our countries of operation, we see also more child labor, exploitative labor. We see more trafficking. We see more child marriage. All these kind of phenomenons that we've been fighting for over the years, all of a sudden we see an influx. So we always say kind of after a natural disaster. So for example, when the tsunami hit South Asia in 2005, I'm sure you remember, it
The
was
big one.
the big one.
Yeah.
Everybody, it was all over the news. I worked personally in these countries before the tsunami, in Thailand, in India, in Sri Lanka. We worked on exploitative child labor and child trafficking, and we could already see major accomplishments. We already saw a reduction in the number of children that were in exploitative situation. And then the tsunami hit, and all of a sudden it took us back 10 years. And I think it's the same with COVID. So we see that in a lot of countries, all of the achievements that we made in the protection sector, in the education sector, all our work with schools, with the local institutions, all of a sudden we see a huge regression that kind of reshuffled everything and made us reassess our work, our operation, our strategy, our everything that we do.
Yeah.
So definitely the whole issue of vulnerability, children at risk, families at risk, women at risk, girls at risk, we see a huge need to address all this situation.
And Bella, so I hear this also, like in food, we're making progress towards zero hunger in the most insecure, and then boom. So it seems like the whole world has the opportunity to recognize this and then come together and bring it back up and then push it everybody, or to just say, oh, too bad, we've lost 10 years. The lost decade is a old phrase. We've used it about different countries and different regions in the past with kind of a shrug. What makes you optimistic that we can take this as a pivot point and go forward?
I think that an emergency, there's an emergency and there's a disaster. We need to differentiate between the two. We don't want this emergency to become a disaster. And I think we're at this point now with COVID. It's an emergency, but we need to make sure the international community, the local institutions in each country, that this emergency doesn't kind of become a huge social and economic disaster. And I think one of the kind of more optimistic angles of the situation is the fact that we've seen in history that a crisis, an emergency, can also become an opportunity, can also change things positively. So we saw in Rwanda, for example, the genocide, the horrible genocide that we've seen during 1994. Now Rwanda is one of the flagships countries
cervical
in
cancer, COVID, women representation in the parliament. Incredible.
Exactly. And I think I don't want to say that this is because of what happened there, because it's a terrible disaster, and I hope that it will not happen again in anytime in the near or far future. But I think we can also use this as an opportunity to reassess, to see how we can support communities, how we can build our social capital, international and locally, how we can really be there for the ones who need us the most. I think it also helped us to think more creatively, think more about kind of distant learning techniques. Some of the
Hmm.
things that we've been doing physically in the countries where we work, we now do remotely. So a lot of the learning platforms, we do them remotely. For example, we have trainings now. We have trainings for facilitators, CFS, facilitators in Colombia. We have trainings for in the pedagogical, the protection aspect. We do it all remotely. We do trainings for government officials. Um, we do in places where we can't operate the CFS physically, where the children can't go and attend the CFS. We do it. We do a mobile CFS when they just move from one neighborhood, from one household to the other. So I think it's a real opportunity to think creatively and critically how we can ensure that our programs are continuing and really address the needs of children, their families, their communities. One of the things that we are now initiating is a program called Healthy Return to School. As I mentioned before, a lot of families in Mozambique, for example, they're really scared to send back their kids to schools because they said that in schools they don't have running water, they don't have drinkable water, they don't keep social distancing, they don't have health facilities. So one of the things that we work on now is to conduct a kind of multi-sectorial assessment for a healthy return to school to make sure
Ah,
that all schools where we work, they integrate all the different elements, educational, public health, wash, protection, so
mhm.
that children and families feel secure, feel safe to send their children back to schools.
To school.
Um, so it really kind of forced us to open our minds and really see how we can mobilize this crisis to think differently and address the needs. And I think we're doing that, and we'll continue doing that. And I think we have kind of full support from the governments. We have great relationship with government officials, government line agencies at the local level, the central level, everywhere we work, with recognized by UNICEF, by the different agencies. So it's definitely something that
So,
is
Bella, it's inspiring to learn about this and to think about the angles, but also your future orientation. And I want to know how I and our listeners can participate in supporting, backing you, being able to give you that extra oomph, because when you're doing so many things, it's the support at the people level that then gives you that just the capacity. So, what do you say? Somebody says, how can I help? What's the best way for listeners, probably in 60 or 70 countries around the world, but largely in the United States? What can we
sure.
do?
Sure, and there's a lot to do, and it's a great question. I think one of the things that I really appreciate about IsraAid is the fact that it has very strong communities of supporters, both in Israel and especially in the States. So these are communities. So, for example, last month we had a training that we delivered to communities and across the states, talking about community resilience, about other things, topics that we work on, reflecting on different case studies from across the world. So, one of kind of major thing that listeners can do is go on our website, subscribe to our newsletter. Also, through the IsraAid USA, you can subscribe to our trainings.
Mm,
There are periodic workshops, trainings delivered by professionals, both from HQ and also from our country offices on different topics. So you can definitely be part of these trainings, learn from us, also have an opportunity to exchange knowledge, share knowledge. I think it's always very important to hear about people's experience and become part of our community. I think Israel is really kind of leaning on its communities, both professionally and not only definitely not only financially. And I think it's really a great opportunity to be part of the organization, to make sure that your voices are also heard, that you're part of the discussions, whatever we do, and we always share the information, share the knowledge, share the good practices, the experience, and we learn from each other. So definitely you can go online, you can subscribe to the newsletter and subscribe to the different kind of communities and the seminars that are running all throughout the year.
Well, it seems like I've heard these three big messages about children first at the center, about reinforcing and supporting the systems that are there, the indigenous people systems, so that they are strengthened, and that the way forward is community support. Wherever you are with your capacity to be supportive, wherever you are where there's a capacity to be part. To me, these three pillars are a fantastic way of thinking, but also they help me to understand the success of IsraAiD and your great work. That success comes because you put all those pieces together. So, Bella Kovner, thank you so much for taking time for being with us today. I want to continue this conversation about other elements, but I also want to make sure that our listeners are really mobilized, because now when we're all upside down, it's easy to be thinking about ourselves and our families. Yes, that's important,
Definitely,
but it's
that's
also
important.
opens our heart to think about how we want to be in the world. And you've
Right.
given us a way to express our humanity in the context of this very global, really every person on the planet touched by this moment. Thank you for giving us that opportunity to be part of making humanity stronger one day at a
Thank
time.
you. Thank you. Thank you very much for these kind of words. And just a couple of words for before we end. And I think this is also, I think all of us are faced with a lot of kind of personal, communal challenges during this time. I think this COVID crisis or emergency hits us all across the, and this is the time to feel like a global village, I think. And we're kind of, we're one community. What makes us one is the good things, but also these emergencies and these situations of crisis. And I think that from a personal perspective, being able to be in a position where you support other people, where you really work for the benefit of others, especially the most vulnerable ones, there's nothing better than that. At least for me, this what
Amen.
like this is a reason to wake up in the morning, and
Thank you.
just the second pillar that you mentioned, strengthening system. It's not only the formal institutions, the formal systems, but also very important to say that kind of the grassroots one, the informal ones, the civil society institutions, the systems, these kind of small grassroots structures, which are vital, I think, for community sustainability and resilience, and building social cohesion and social capital, especially during these days. So
Amen. Thank you so much. And thank you. And I look forward to our next conversation. Goodbye now.
thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye. Bye.